Riverview Plantation spread 3,000 acres on the eastern banks of the mighty Mississippi, near the settlement known as Fort Adams, with Natchez to the north and Baton Rouge to the south. Seasonal flooding of the river provided its white inhabitants rich fertile soil, producing a multitude of crops: cotton, sugar, indigo, and a human crop in the form of slaves. The big house, a large affair, made of white stuccoed brick, with white columns running the full length to the roof of the gallery, where a large second-floor gallery overlooked the river, and was the perfect place to catch a late afternoon breeze. Formal gardens filled with crepe myrtles, mountain laurels, and roses offered charming promenade down river rock paths outlined in monkey grass. Behind the main house was a complex of outbuildings that formed a self-containing community, each connected to the next by a gravel path, starting with the two-story wooden kitchen house where all of the cooking and preserving were done, as well as where the kitchen servants slept at night. The kitchen was close enough for meals to be brought into the back door and into the dining room of the main house, and at the same time keeping the smells of cooking and preserving from filling the main house. The well house was directly behind the kitchen, where items such as milk, eggs, cheese, and butter were lowered into the cold water to keep them fresh, as well as jugs of sweet chilled tea and lemonade when lemons were in season. The kitchen garden was close behind the kitchen, where a crew was kept busy weeding and gathering crops during the full growing season. Then there were smaller cabins with special uses, such as the smokehouse for smoking and drying meats, then a group of small buildings known as the factory. This group consisted of the spinning house for spinning of wools and cotton into yarn, the loom house for weaving of homespun fabric that was used to make the field hands clothing, then the sewing house where the fabrics were made into clothing. Across from the factory complex was the storehouse, where supplies were stored for the plantation and given out as needed by the mistress of the plantation. Next to the storehouse was the dairy, where raw milk was made into other useful products for plantation life, such as butter, cream, clabber, buttermilk, and cottage cheese. Now behind the dairy was the wash house, where all the laundry was done for the big house and the kitchen. Farther away from the house was the livery stable and the blacksmith shop, leather shops where all the harness and shoes were made, hen houses, pig pens, milk barns, then the slave quarters where the slaves lived. The original mistress insisted that they be built at a distance where they could not smell any offensive odors that might float up to the big house. 30-year-old John LeBlanc, fourth-generation master of Riverview Plantation, and a Creole whose French family were one of the founding families of New Orleans, was tall, fair, with bright blue eyes and wavy blonde hair the color of wheat. John had spent all of his life learning his job of master. However, Angelique, his wife, came into her position ill-equipped of the knowledge of running a large plantation. Angelique, growing to young adulthood in the safe cocoon of her family home in New Orleans, where learning the art of the piano, needlepoint, and lace-making were the major subjects of her study. She had spent 3 years in the Burlington Academy, where she learned to read, cipher numbers, and use her brain to figure out how to keep her dance card filled and snare just the right bow that would make her a fine husband. She had met handsome John during the Christmas ball of 1836. He was a tall, handsome, and gallant young man of a fine Creole family, of whom had been a part of Louisiana society long before her own family had arrived. After a short courtship, they were married in an elaborate ceremony in the Catholic Church, with a reception at her family home afterward. Then all too soon she made her way to his family plantation upriver in the Mississippi Delta. On the plantation she learned quickly that she was in charge of not only the house, but the kitchen, the gardens, the dairy, the factory, the storehouse, the wash house, the smokehouse, the hospital, and the chapel. When she arrived, John's mother, Marcia, was there to welcome her and show her firsthand what she would be responsible for during her days as mistress. After a mere 6 weeks training time for Angelique, Marcia made her departure for Le Petit Chateau, a cottage some distance away from the main plantation complex, which had been the original plantation house, then later the residence of John's grandmother when she retired there. It was a LeBlanc family tradition that gave the new mistress a chance to take charge of her duties of the plantation, and at the same time giving the much overworked ex-mistress rest, relaxation, and a time to dabble in her own trifles at long last. Marcia took with her her personal servants, a cook, a housekeeper, and her longtime personal maid, Matilda, who had been a wedding gift and was now more of a companion and friend than a slave. Marcia's husband died from a stroke after lingering for several years in a much incapacitating and humiliating state of torment to himself and those around him. He was now buried in the family cemetery on the plantation near Le Petit Chateau, so she could spend many hours visiting with him under the shade tree while engaging in needlepoint, which was a favorite pastime of hers.